when governments and institutions fail. Many people died in this land, but many also endured and devised their own survival. So I do want to thank Mr. Dino for that very humble reminder. I'm going to talk about civilians protecting themselves from mass atrocity and the ways that we do or do not support that. When I say protecting, I place as much importance on preparedness as on prevention. It's important to prepare for a failure to prevent conflict. And it's important to prepare for failure of outside rescue. Is early warning a complete failure if it doesn't result in prevention or outside rescue? No. If properly wired, warning can lead to preparedness. It can give people at risk more time for preparing ways to protect themselves. When I say protecting themselves, I place civilians at the center of their own protection. The responsibility to protect often becomes theirs first and foremost. The responsibility to prepare often becomes theirs. We know from yesterday's discussion certainly that preparedness includes mechanisms for early warning and response. Okay, when I say warning and response, I refer not only to conventional warning operated by outsiders, but also warning run by the civilians who are actually in the path of danger. I refer not only to conventional responses focused on resolving conflict or sending in rescuers, but also global survival responses simply focused on staying alive. There are hundreds and hundreds of such tactics and strategies. We've begun to inventory them. I think a few more added a few minutes ago. These local tactical lessons learned are almost never shared from one crisis from culture to another. And when I say warning and response, finally, I refer not only to those based on technological breakthroughs, but also based on human behavior and on the social architecture behind self-protection. I may be wrong, but I don't think the early warning community and R2P communities talk very much about how locals survive and even serve each other alone in the face of violence. Why are there methods of survival, of self-preservation, of more than anthropological interest to us? Why is Mr. Neal's story of more than historical interest to us? Maybe it's because his story was multiplied many thousands and thousands of times by individuals and families, because their capacity to learn survival saved more than the outside world did. So I'm going to suggest that if you want your good efforts to be even more connected with local self-protection, you need a connector. I'm going to suggest there's a third community that may be able to facilitate that connection. Excuse me, using a simplistic term like community to identify diverse groups of responders. But the third community I'm referring to are the 8 organizations, both development and relief, both indigenous and expatriate. These organizations, in one, they can support local capacity for self-protection, and also, I'll contend here, they can support a two-way awareness, a two-way understanding between local and outside protection efforts. So these are my key points. Outside efforts to protect locals are too often incapacitated. The locals themselves have enormous capacity. They very often take the initiative, the responsibility to protect. And when there's no resolution of conflict or rescue from it, then their approaches to warning and response can be very different than ours. Still, there's great potential in our R2P and early warning efforts, the types that were discussed yesterday. I think one challenge is to adapt or connect those to the civilians actually at risk, those in the path of danger. And if there's any entity that can adapt and connect to civilians at risk, it's the local or foreign aid agency. Though there are sensitivities, the R2 S2P and early warning and aid communities can work together on protection, I think in smarter ways, and with greater awareness, appreciation of local efforts to survive. I'll say a couple words about the responsibility to protect and endeavor to warn and respond. In the last 15 years, there were some 87 wars, at least that's listed by Wikipedia. And a war is not just a war, it includes things like genocide in Rwanda or regime-induced famine and repression in North Korea. Over the last 15 years, there were some 54 conflicts with state-induced displacement of civilians. And God only knows how many times non-state actors attacked and displaced civilians. And all the while, we had Geneva Conventions and genocide conventions. We had guiding principles and international humanitarian law. We had peacekeeping apparatus. We had, tens of thousands of groups dedicated to conflict resolution. We had advocates, think tanks, and donors all supporting these good efforts, and they saved many. But as you know, over the last 15 years, we were unable to save millions. It's a reasonable guess that over the next 15, there will again be millions more who face violence alone within their own country's borders. I agree with Professor Luck, who some 2 months ago told members of the UN General Assembly that we need, and I quote, a keen appreciation of the limitations of external action. And he said our capacity will never match the scope of the task. So while we continue to improve these good efforts, that's plan A, let's also prepare for our professional limitations and our inevitable failures. Let's think outside the box, and that's plan B. Let's just assume that for this talk, that sooner or later the things that your organizations are good at are going to fail. Let's agree that somewhere, sometime again, hell will be visited upon earth. We have another responsibility, and that's the responsibility to admit and anticipate our limitations. You know, the common description of our to be goes something like this, that states have a primary responsibility for protecting their citizens. But when they prove patently unwilling or unable, that responsibility vests upward and upward to the international community. You just hear much, much less about how responsibility and capacity for raw survival and for service to others also vests downward to the civilians themselves. Of all the possible protections, self-protection will be the last one standing, because it rests on the abilities of the very people who are left standing alone as violence shuts the world out. I do want to say a few words about how locals protect themselves, and wanted to draw your attention to a preliminary inventory called How Civilians Survive Violence. There are some copies on your tables that looks either like this or this. There's certainly more available for folks interested who can email me after the conference. I'll be happy to send copies your way. And we certainly do invite you to help us expand and improve upon this very new type of inventory in the months ahead. The inventory currently cites about 500 ways that civilians keep themselves alive, and I'm sure you can think of more from your own experiences. It's broken into 3 primary areas, one being physical safety, and the others being life-critical sustenance and life-critical services. Why sustenance and services, you might wonder? It's because civilians themselves often equate these elemental needs with their own security. They often take physical risks to obtain these elemental needs. And they die in far, far greater numbers, not from direct violence, but from the collapse of sustenance and services. A collapse that's, to some extent, can be anticipated and prepared for. Altogether, these tactics and strategies have saved millions of lives. Civilian self-protection does often begin with more conventional political, civil, legalistic measures, the kind of measures that we're more familiar with, the kind we spoke about yesterday, the kind that we're supportive of. But when those efforts reach their limits, as they often do, then locals' actions can become rather unorthodox, at least in our eyes. At the point of contact between victim and abuser, self-protection is unconventional. It's extremely tactical. From the Khmer Rouge, or Arakan's Tigers in Bosnia, or Taupison's death squads in El Salvador, when the Interhamwe or the Janjaweed or the Lord's Resistance Army come to your village or your home, you're going to react tactfully. You're going to deal or pay, run or hide, fight them or join them. You will. You're going to take discreet, unorthodox steps to secure life-saving sustenance and services. There are many ways to accommodate your abusers. Take just one. Casey made himself too valuable to his abusers to be killed. And Dith Prana, I think, if I understand the story, did the same by becoming a caretaker to one of his captor's children. I might have that story wrong. There are very many strategies, just some highlighted in this inventory, by which to avoid abusers. These sometimes get to be integrated and rather sophisticated, culminating in local early warning and flight. There are many strategies by which to get life-sustaining sustenance amid the collapse of production and markets. And there are many strategies by which life-critical services can be obtained even amid the collapse of conventional programs. The inventory you have there is a global list of actions that civilians have sometimes taken. We place no judgment on whether a given action is wise in a given situation. An act that can save lives in one place might well cost lives in another. But we invite you to look at the inventory and please consider the broad scope of civilian self-protection. Consider how life-saving practices can be shared and how the learning curve for survival can be shortened. I want to say a few words about the protection roles of development and relief organizations, and just for shorthand, I'll refer to them as aid organizations here. There are also representatives of the aid community in our audience, and I imagine that they find it challenging to relate yesterday's discussion to their daily work, and I found it a challenge too. It's important to point out the unique and comparative advantages that aid organizations can possess. Just think of the sheer number of indigenous and expatriate aid NGOs. Consider their vast reach and presence, their potential, I say potential, to be a massive bulwark for protection. They are the most apt to have the best access, the best local contacts and trust, the best situational awareness and cultural nuance. Not always, but often. And this creates unique chances to support protection and warning in locally understood ways. Aid NGOs are apt to have the most appropriate skill sets, at least in terms of life-critical sustenance and services and community mobilization. And they may have the most plausible cover or alibi for being in remote and unstable areas, and even comparative autonomy of action sometimes. We'll talk about that later. But how do aid organizations operationalize what they feel is their own responsibility to protect? For over a decade, they've fostered protection through their mainstream aid mission, making their programs more sensitive to conflict. They've come a long way in that regard. And secondly, they foster protection through an expanded mission, some would say mission creep, addressing rights, governance, rule of law, and civil society, all with the aim of preempting violence. I see two other